away. Wake away. Wake away. Wake away.
Hey, fantastic folks, welcome back to another episode of Controversialism by Ankur Bhuya. Today, we will be talking about how the United States violated human rights in a place called Guantanamo Bay. So, let's get on with it. Yeah. So, human beings, the apex predator of the world, seen as the best product of Earth's evolution, can sometimes be very cruel and savage. We have created society and culture, yet we have not shed the last vestiges of our reptilian brain. The animalistic instinct which comes from the limbic part of the brain is still there very much in our mind. No animal can become the apex predator in the jungle without having the thirst to kill. So today, I will introduce you to a dark chapter in human history. I will talk about a prison shrouded with allegations of detaining innocent civilians without any formal charge and trial. They were subjected to unspeakable torture and horror. The walls of the Guantanamo Bay prison bears witness to the harrowing echoes of screams and human pain. It is proof of how the Western world exhibits hypocrisy when it comes to human rights violations, and how the United States government, which does not waste a second to school and tutor a country like ours, conducted barbaric torture and unspeakable horror on innocents. Firstly, let's examine the history of Guantanamo Bay. We'll talk about the Platt Amendment, which was passed by the US Congress in 1901. It granted the United States certain rights and privileges in Cuba, including the lease of Guantanamo Bay for use as a naval base. If we go further back in history, in 1898, there was a war between the United States and Spain. When the Spaniards lost in battle, the United States of America seized control of territories like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. They were all colonial states initially. These formerly Spanish territories gained independence, and so did Cuba. but they in a way remained under American influence. The Platt Amendment was introduced in Congress, which pledged that the United States would not annex Cuba and would leave the island to its people once Spain's colonial rule ended. The US interfered in Cuba's constitution, politics, and economy. The provisions mentioned in the Platt Agreement allowed the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs to maintain so called stability, protect American interests, and oversee Cuba's transition into becoming a country. Still, Guantanamo Bay Naval Base became a permanent fixture in Cuban history. The Platt Amendment remained until 1934, when it was abrogated as part of the Good Neighbor policy under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But the naval base was not dismantled, despite opposition and resentment from human rights organizations. Post the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, which killed 3,000 Americans and injured 6,000 people, the Supreme Court of America gave special powers to President George W. Bush to pursue the perpetrators of this attack and bring them to justice. President Bush set up the Guantanamo Bay prison, which allowed for so-called flexible interrogation techniques and prevented the inmates from obtaining legal protection as prisoners of war. This was a strategic move because outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, the members of the US military would not be liable and convicted in US courts. The prison was a grey area since the naval base was not considered as US soil, unlike the embassies of any country. Beyond the purview of the media, there would be no concrete evidence of the blatant violation of the Geneva Convention and subjecting inmates to unspeakable torture and harassment. Several individuals were rounded up and put in this prison without any formal charge or acceptance of proof. The majority of the inmates came from Afghanistan, and others were from Islamic countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Qatar. The Americans labeled these prisoners as enemy combatants rather than prisoners of war. This loophole negated the enforcing rules under the Geneva Convention and afforded the prisoners less legal protection under international law. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have published detailed reports on the prison in Camp X-Ray. Camp X-Ray is criticized and condemned by many countries, but these stories seldom come into the limelight due to biased reporting from Western news outlets. The detentions have been done arbitrarily, without any fair trial. Most prisoners live in inhumane conditions. Issues include overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and the solitary way of confinement. The main allegations of human rights violations are black ops techniques of torture methods used for interrogation. This includes waterboarding, which involves the controlled drowning of a detainee by pouring water over their face with a wet cloth. This induced a sensation of drowning. This violates international law. Sleep deprivation is another technique used, which leads to severe psychological effects including disorientation, hallucination, and cognitive impairment. Prisoners are subjected to stressful positions such as standing or kneeling for long hours. They do not even get the space to stand up properly since most of the prisoners are shoved into closed wooden boxes. Exposure to extreme temperatures like extreme heat and extreme cold is also used as a form of torture, which can lead to heat strokes and hypothermia. Physical abuse is common, where prisoners are brutally assaulted, slapped, and punched. Many attacks lead to bruises, broken bones, and internal injuries. Sexual humiliation is one of the major forms of torture. This also includes forced nudity in the presence of female staffers. Taunting is common, along with invasive body searches, which were also considered common. Sexual humiliation is intended to degrade and intimidate the prisoners. Psychologically, if you are manipulated, it induces a sense of fear and confusion, and it also caused psychological distress when the soldiers used to threaten their loved ones. These are some of the few techniques that the American soldiers and the CIA were using. In official reports, a lot of other forms of abuse are redacted and omitted, but many witnesses have narrated about attacks on human dignity. The American soldiers would put dog collars on the prisoners and drag them with a leash. Prisoners were urinated upon. There were instances of desecration of the Holy Book, and many got their teeth and hair pulled out, and unfortunately, even rape was also one of the methods to intimidate the prisoners. One of the primary legal challenges faced by US courts was the lack of jurisdiction on foreign soil. There were significant court battles, which was led by many human rights organizations. In 2008, in a ruling in US court, the Supreme Court rather, there was a monumental decision in the case regarding there were many landmark decisions by the US Supreme Court which ruled in favor of the detainees. They were given constitutional rights to challenge their detention in US federal courts through habeas corpus petitions. This paved the way for legal proceedings to address human rights violations. Hundreds of cases were filed. The US Supreme Court gave various judgments, with outcomes ranging from detainees being released due to insufficient evidence to rulings in favor of the US government when it came to national security. In some cases, detainees were found to have been detained unlawfully, and there were clear evidence of human rights violation. The US courts have awarded compensation and provided avenues for justice. Overall, the US courts have played a crucial role in adjudicating Guantanamo Bay victims, how their rights were violated, and how still the US court was successful in upholding the rule of law and ensuring accountability for unlawful detention and mistreatment. Let's look at some of the experience and testimonials of former prisoners. Mohammed Slahi was held in the prison for 14 years without charge. He was released in 2016. Slahi maintained his innocence and gave details of the humiliation and torture he endured. His experience is detailed in his memoir, Guantanamo Diary. Shakir Amir spent over 13 years in prison. He is a British citizen and has spoken publicly about his experiences, sharing the inhumane pain of torture, blindfolding, and solitary confinement. Muhammad Beg, a British Pakistani, about his experience of being imprisoned without charge. In his book, Enemy Combatant, My Imprisonment at Guantanamo and Kandahar. Now he runs an organization which advocates on behalf of the detainees. These are broken men, people who have been scarred for life, stewing in the memory of being treated worse than animals and stripped of their human dignity and rights. Since 2001, it has been 13 years, and this prison has been a thorn in the side of many American presidents. What was started by George W. Bush through military commissions passed on to the Obama administration. President Obama made efforts to close the prison during his tenure, but the US Congress made it their mission to malign Mr. Obama, even going to the extent of keeping this prison operational and playing politics over it. President Trump was a staunch supporter of this prison and even wanted to fill more prisoners, calling them bad dudes in Guantanamo. President Biden promised to close the detention camp, according to the sentiments which were echoed by President Obama. However, the process of closure remains complicated with legal and security considerations to navigate. Thus, one central pillar of the American government's cruelty and disregard for human rights still stands tall. We are used to getting lectures on human rights violations regarding Kashmir and minority rights, but I think the US government should look at its own history of breaking nations and their people in the name of national security. Violence begets violence, and no amount of compensation can silence the walls of Guantanamo Bay as they still echo the screams of torture and humiliation. Thank you, folks. I'll be seeing you soon in the next episode.